to as we go. This is session 3 of 4, and we're going to start out this morning or this afternoon and move to cover the parts of last week's lecture we didn't finish up with. So last week, if you remember, we stopped in the middle of the Russian Civil War. So on the one side you had the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, the communists, and on the other side you had everybody who opposed them. And that included nobles who kind of wanted the old regime back, some elements of the moderates who had wanted revolution but not the Bolshevik style. You had nationalists in different parts of what became the Soviet Union who had hoped that revolution meant independence for them, and then they found out it didn't. So all of these people together were opposing the Red Army, but the Red Army had that central bit you can see on the map, the bit that's in orange. That was the central part that the Bolsheviks were defending. And the White Army, their opponents were coming at it from all sides, but had a really hard time coordinating themselves. So first we're going to just talk about the end of the Civil War, the reasons for the Red Army victory, why the communists won that war, was because in many ways they had better leadership and better organization. They're fighting defensively around the center, which is easy to organize, or easier to organize. They had good military leaders. They had leaders who could figure out how to move the troops around. They had access to railways, which was very important in terms of moving troops and supplies to where they were needed. And they had the industrial centers, which was important in terms of producing weaponry or other products that they needed in their fight. The tactics and the wider support, I mean, part of the issue was that the Red Army had a very clear case to make. They had a campaign that they were defending for what they saw as the true revolution. Their opponents had a harder time trying to figure out what was their common message. I mean, the common message was, we don't like the Bolsheviks, but there wasn't anything much beyond that under which they could find unity, and that made it hard for their opponents. The Red Army could also spin the conflict as a patriotic one. In other words, they could say, well, you know those White Army folks? They're getting support from America. They're getting support from England, from France. And we are the true Russians. We are the ones who are defending the homeland against these foreigners who are trying to interfere in our affairs. So they're able to target their opponents as folks who were taking help from others outside of Russia, and that was not that good. So the end result was a lot of destruction, a lot of conflict. The war went on for years. And the deaths from conflict, from illness, from lack of food during the warfare, it was as high as 30 million people died in the Russian Civil War. So it was very, very deadly. And that just came right after World War I. So World War I was deadly, then the Civil War was deadly, and unfortunately we're not finished. There's more to come. By the end of the Civil War, so we're talking about 1921, 22, Russia was in a bad way. The Soviet Union was in a bad way. Feeding this population had been very difficult during the World War I years and now during the Civil War years. The Soviet government, the communist government, managed this by installing what they called war communism. And war communism meant that the government had the right to confiscate anything that it perceived as surplus. So that could be extra pairs of shoes, extra clothing, food of any kind, including grain. So the government could come and just confiscate stuff from people and tell them, well, it's because of the war. Now, on the one hand, there could be a legitimate argument to make that there's always a problem in wartime with people hoarding things. You've heard of hoarding, right? Trying to keep things for yourself and hope the price goes up or whatever, not allowing that to go onto the market. And there could be an argument to make to say it's good if the government regulates things so that there's no hoarding. But it went way beyond that. The end result was simply that people who were even just keeping grain on hand to plant for the next harvest were accused of hoarding and had that grain taken away, and it's impossible to produce food under such circumstances. There was no incentive to plant, and there was nothing to plant with. So the end result is devastating. This is the aftermath of the Civil War. And you'll see these poor children there, famished. This is the famine of 1921-22 that struck as the Civil War was ending, and it's due to the fact that war has been rampaging around, but also that this war communism has taken away from people the ability to plant anything, grow anything, and so on and so forth. So the end result is starvation, or near starvation, which affected up to 5 million peasants in Russia at the time. So what to do about this? Interestingly, this is the phase at which the Soviet Union was open to help from elsewhere. So as the Civil War came to an end, the Russians were willing to accept aid from elsewhere to help deal with this huge problem, that there just wasn't enough food to go around. So many countries provided aid. The United States provided food aid and personnel to alleviate the suffering in Russia at the time. The US government passed what they called the Russian Famine Relief Act in 1921. They committed up to $20 million, and they set up what they were calling the American Relief Administration. And much of that was under the oversight of Herbert Hoover. You know Herbert Hoover, he later became president, that same guy. He was in charge of the American Relief Administration to provide this aid to Russia. Now it's really interesting because you'd think, wait a moment, aren't they communist? How come the US is providing them with help? Well, first of all, the humanitarian catastrophe was something that everybody could get a hold of. Second, the Americans felt that if they provided help, they had more of a chance to influence the way things would go in Russia and help that stabilize the country and keep it from going in a very, very radical form. And it just seemed to be the right thing to do. So aid was coming from the United States. Other organizations helped, the Red Cross. International Quaker groups were providing aid. The British Save the Children Fund got involved. And they fed and clothed and helped a huge amount of people. So I think I've got a slide. The next slide shows you something. Okay, America's contribution to the Russian famine relief effort. So just look at this. Children fed daily, over 4 million. Adults fed daily, over 6 million. Maximum number fed daily, over 10 million. Number of meals served, 1.75 billion. Number of kitchens, people clothed, medical supplies, hospitals, inoculations, vaccinations, tons of food, tons of medical supplies. Number of US ships provided. There's a lot of help coming in. And that's hugely beneficial. The Russians were grateful. They said so, which was really good. And momentarily, at least, it looked like things were almost settling down between Russia and the other countries around the world. The program ended, however, the American Relief Administration ended its work quite abruptly, actually, in 1923, when they realized that the Soviet Union was exporting grain, even as the aid groups were bringing grain in to feed people. And that was like, okay, we're done here. We're not doing this anymore. So the help came to a pretty big stop at that point. Meanwhile, the Russians were pursuing their policies of reorganizing the economy, and that included nationalizing companies. So companies that had been in private hands prior to the Russian Revolution, maybe even during parts of the Civil War, now they are nationalized. By 1919, already 80% of large factories were nationalized, which means they're now in government hands. They're run by the government. The problem is that the government took over factories without necessarily having the staff to run them, right? So you take it over, it's in government hands, but those who knew how to do the work have either fled or been kicked out and removed, and now nobody knows how to run the machinery, nobody knows how to repair something when it's broken. It's all very difficult. There's a drastic drop in production as nationalization takes hold, because The new staff doesn't really know how to take care of this. The other big employer after the Russian Revolution comes in its more radical phase, the other big employer was the government, because all this work of nationalizing and reorganizing and so on, that needs a lot of people, so that by 1918, 1 out of 4 adults in Petrograd, what used to be St. Petersburg, is working for the government. By the end of 1921 into 1922, the Russians realized, okay, this is not working. And Lenin really saw that there was a problem here. We can't keep this going in this way. The war communism, the nationalizing of the factories, taking away people's stuff, it's not working out so well. And there was actually a rebellion in 1921 among the sailors at the Kronstadt base. They're Russian sailors, and they rebelled because they were upset that the promises that the Soviet government had made about, you remember, bread, land, peace? Well, the bread promise especially does not seem to be coming through. So these sailors were upset, they rebelled, the rebellion was crushed, but there are serious implications that Lenin and his colleagues are actually thinking about. Which means that they put out a plan, it's called the New Economic Policy, and the New Economic Policy actually ran in Russia from 1921 through 1928. And the new economic policy was interesting. In some ways, you could think of it as a backtracking from Soviet planned economies. The new economic policy aimed to restore the Russian economy by allowing a certain amount of free market operations, right? So it's not working in this system, we need to try something else. A certain measure of free market operations where people, especially in farming, are allowed to sell the product of their land and keep the profits after having paid taxes to the government on the harvest. The aim was to encourage people to contribute to the nation's food supply by appealing to their self-interest. The idea was if they got to keep the surplus, they would work more and produce more. And the peasants during the new economic policy could own small parcels of land and small amounts of livestock. And the new economic policy proved to be successful. It worked. It worked. The economy by the mid-1920s is reviving. The economic production was rebounding to the levels before the revolution, which was not high, but it's a lot better than it was. The problem, of course, is that the new economic policy did not comport well with the ideas of communism, right? It's hard to make the case for that if you're a strong communist that the new economic policy really is good. It was necessary, but a lot of hardline communists, as we see, didn't like it because it felt like it was going back towards capitalism. But in the meantime, it worked, and that's important. People start making more food, getting more production, and they do this in a number of ways. So, a new currency is put out. It's a temporary thing. It's called the chervonnay, and it's tied to the value of gold, right? So it's a more stable currency for the Russians. They start investing in agriculture. You've got a stamp here from 1923 with a rather lovely tractor. And a poster encouraging literacy for women, education, with a slogan, if you don't read books, you'll soon forget how to read and write. Okay, so investments in education, in farming, a more stable economy. The new economic policy helped settle things down in Russia, and it lasted through 1928. And we'll figure out why it doesn't go past 1928 in a moment. I want to finish up on Lenin next, and that's just to talk about the last years of Lenin's life. He dies in 1924. In the last years of his life, he was increasingly plagued by ill health. He wasn't that old, right? I mean, he's born in 1870, so by 1920, he's just 50 years old, but he was prematurely aging. He suffered a series of strokes, one after the other, and by the third stroke, he was partially paralyzed. There's pictures of him that aren't really publicized where he's in a wheelchair. You know, he's just having a really hard time. He recovered somewhat after each stroke, but never got all the way back to better. And then finally in 1924, January 1924, he died. Like any movement, when the person who's sort of seen as the key leader dies, it's a very difficult period, right? What are we going to do next? Where do we go next? What happens next? Well, the first thing that happened was that Lenin's body became an object of veneration. And it can still be seen today. If you go to Moscow, you can visit the mausoleum and see Lenin's body lying in state. They had it embalmed. So it's there, and you can see it, and it was a big deal at the time and after. I think within the 3 days after his death, about 1 million people came to view his body and pay their respects. And that's in January, a Russian January, right? Cold, very cold, and yet the population's coming. He was viewed as this hero, and the mausoleum kept, and the preservation of his body kept, to sort of honor his major contribution. At one point, I know, it's not like recently, but within the last 20 years or so on, the embalming process was kind of not working so well. And bits of him were kind of going off, as it were. So they had to close, I think they closed it down and re-embalmed him or something to make him last longer, as it were. Bodies are not designed to be put up like this on view. But regardless, there he is in his mausoleum, and that's that. But the question was, who was going to take over after him? Now, if you remember, way back, I'll go back a bit here. Let me go back some. All right, there's Lenin, right? The man next to him is Trotsky. And Trotsky actually was a very good administrator. He had done a lot of very effective work for the Red Army during the Civil War. And Lenin, I think, thought fairly highly of his administrative abilities and his capacities. And then the third man in this group is Stalin, and we're going to talk a lot more about Stalin in a minute. I think it's fair to say that Lenin was worried about Stalin, did not think that Stalin himself was the best candidate for going forward as the leader. And there's actually a very interesting document, and it's not entirely sure whether it was entirely Lenin's view or maybe the views of Lenin's wife, who really didn't like Stalin. But anyway, this is a quotation from Lenin's, part of what's called Lenin's Testament, which is sort of his views on others in the party and the Communist Party and what should happen to them. Okay. So 4th of January 1923, so a year before Lenin died. Stalin is too crude, and this defect, which is entirely acceptable in our milieu and in relationships among us as communists, becomes unacceptable in the position of General Secretary. So you have to understand, General Secretary does not sound like a prestigious position, but that was actually the position of power in the Communist Party and in the government of Russia at this time. So not president or anything like that, but General Secretary, because the General Secretary always continued, right, had that key role. Lenin thought Stalin should not be the General Secretary. I therefore proposed to comrades that they should devise a means of removing him from this job and should appoint to this job someone else who is distinguished from Comrade Stalin in all other respects only by the single superior aspect that he should be more tolerant, more polite, and more attentive towards comrades, less capricious, etc. And we're going to talk more about Stalin in a moment. But clearly here there are some anxieties from Lenin about Stalin, not thinking this is the best person in the job, and definitely not saying anything like, this is my heir, or this is the man who should take over after me, even though that's what happened. Okay? So there's some concerns there from Lenin's point of view. Stalin, meanwhile, really did whatever he could to show that he was, in fact, or suggest that he was, in fact, Lenin's heir. So there are some photographs where Stalin and Lenin are sitting close together, and Stalin's really trying to show that he's the one whom Lenin turned to, especially in his last years. So there's a complicated relationship there. Okay. I'm next going to talk about Stalin, but before I do, are there any questions here or anything anybody wants to ask or find out about? We have the microphone. Nope, in the front. There we go. Just wait, Marjo's coming with the micro.
How much did ethnicity play into this, with Stalin being a Georgian and Trotsky being Jewish?
That's an interesting question. So the question of ethnicity, yes, Trotsky was Jewish, And that may have made some people in Russia suspicious of him because there was a fairly long tradition of anti-Semitism within Russia. So that might have been, for some people, a question mark over Trotsky. And Stalin himself was from Georgia, which is one of the areas became part of the Soviet Union. Again, the ethnic Russians tended to look down to a certain extent on those who weren't ethnic Russians, who were from different areas, different ethnic groups that made up the greater Soviet Union. I think it's fair to say that Stalin himself had a bit of inferiority complex about his own background. And the reputation of Georgians were that they were kind of crude and not very polished in their demeanor and so on and so forth. So that could have played something in there too, certainly from Lenin's point of view, that he may have looked askance, let's say, at Stalin coming from a more unsophisticated background, shall we say. But it's hard to know after that if it played a lot of roles, at least for Stalin. It doesn't seem to have affected him beyond that, maybe those questions early on. Yeah, over here. So Marjorie's going to come round.
How was the successor going to be determined? Was it just purely Lenin's personal choice and that was it, or was there some group decision involved?
So technically, the good question, how was the succession decided? So technically, it is not one-man rule in Russia at the time. Technically, there is a group that running the Soviet Union, a committee, basically. But in practical purposes, whoever held the general secretary's position was going to be the key person. So Lenin's view would have carried weight. It is not clear that at the time of his death he had sort of made it clear, like, this is the person who should be next. So there is a committee, but the committee can be swayed, let's put it that way. And Stalin certainly had his eye on the prize the whole time. He was not going to give up this idea. He definitely wanted to be leader. And that, I think, is true all the way along. All right, let's get acquainted with Stalin. There's one of these pictures in the middle of Stalin and Lenin sitting close together. There's some suggestions that some of these photos were very staged and that Stalin on purpose sat close so he would look like he was closer to Lenin than he really was. All right, so we need to know about Stalin, and we're going to do Stalin now for all the rest of this class today, all the way up to 1939 and the start of World War II. So we want to understand how Joseph Stalin came to power, what his impact was on the Soviet Union until 1939. It is fair to say that Stalin's reputation, apart from the years of World War II, which we'll talk about separately, Stalin's reputation has been a very negative one as a tyrant. And we're going to talk a lot about the reasons why he got that reputation, I think in many ways very deserved. So, what do we need to know about Stalin? Well, he's 9 years younger than Lenin, so he's a slightly younger man. He was the same age as Trotsky. They're born in the same year, in 1879. He was born and brought up in Georgia, which is in western Russia. He was the youngest of 3 sons, but his 2 older brothers died in infancy. So he is his parents' only surviving child. His mother was extremely devout, an Orthodox Christian, and she was very attached to her one remaining child, not surprisingly. His dad did not have much education. His dad worked as a cobbler, so he worked with leather to make shoes. And it is very clear from the accounts of his life that his dad was an alcoholic and abusive, and it was a very violent household. It was not a happy place in which to grow up. There were fights, there were beatings. It was quite a violent upbringing for him. So there's no happy home life there for Stalin. Young Stalin suffered through various illnesses. He caught smallpox. In fact, he had smallpox scars on his face, and on the posters and pictures, those are kind of airbrushed out, right? They don't show that. He had had an accident as a boy. He'd been hit by a sort of a runaway cart and had a weakened left arm as a result. So one of his arms was not working fully. And the third thing you should know is he was not very tall. He was all of 5'4", which makes him shorter than me. And people didn't realize this because A, he wore platform shoes to make him taller, and he tended to stand at a podium on a box or something like that to make him taller as well. His mother wanted him to become a priest in the Orthodox Church. She's a very devout lady. That's what she wants for her son. It's a good career. And this is before the Russian Revolution, right? So young Joseph should go and study to be a priest. So he's sent to a local church school, then on to seminary. His father does not seem to have been keen on this idea, did not want his son to move out of his working class background, but the mother prevailed. The problem was there was not a lot of money in the household for all these studies, so he did get some scholarships, some financial assistance, and so on. And in church school, when he was a boy, he seems to have been a good student, had a good voice for singing. And in the first part of his time in seminary, it seemed to have gone fairly well as well. However, as he got to be a teenager, a young adult, he increasingly resisted the austere atmosphere of the seminary and left the seminary without finishing his training in 1899, when he was all of 20 years old. He already had an interest in left-wing ideas, in radical ideas, and he links up then with the communists and with Lenin. He joined left-wing groups, became a sort of an agitator in these groups, ended up with a couple of prison sentences. He was exiled temporarily to Siberia, but it sounds worse than it really was. It was sort of a kind of house arrest, basically. So it wasn't too difficult for him. He didn't have such a hard time. And he went to prison several times, all between before the 1917 revolution. He met Lenin, I think, for the first time outside of the country when there was a Bolshevik meeting in Finland. And Finland was kind of the cross-border protection area for those who had to flee Tsarist Russia. So he met Lenin at that point. Now, at first, Stalin did not make a good impression on his fellow Bolsheviks. He was perceived, again, as too crude, too boorish, someone who was more willing to shout than to listen. And we may all know people like that in our backgrounds. Gradually, he learned at least a veneer of proper behavior at meetings and so on and so forth. So he did learn somewhat how to do things, and he gradually gained more clout and more status. He became a member of the Central Committee under Lenin's leadership. And by 1917, he had a strong record of participation in Bolshevik activities, including running an illegal newspaper, participating in demonstrations, the kinds of things Bolsheviks got up to in these years right before and at the revolution. Gradually, he rose in the party. During the revolution itself, he played a relatively small role. In the Civil War, his title was Commissioner for Nationalities. I don't know if they thought that because he was a Georgian, he might manage to sort of bring in different groups of people into the Bolshevik cause. He was involved in some of the Red Army fighting against the White Army, but that didn't go terribly well. He tended to think he knew more than experienced commanders. And we're going to see this again and again as one of the traits of Stalin's character. He felt he knew more than experts. And so he would countermand their orders, and that obviously did not go well. After the Civil War, he continued, however, his rise in the party. And especially, as I said, he's very careful to portray himself as Lenin's right-hand man. And the fact that Lenin had these strokes and was weakened enabled Stalin to sort of portray himself in that way without Lenin being able to contradict him very, very effectively. At Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin managed to sort of elbow out the other contenders and become sort of the last man standing. Trotsky, by the way, could see what was happening and fled. Right? He didn't stay in Soviet Russia after Lenin's death. He left. And Trotsky ended up all the way, he gets sort of chased from pillar to post. He's in Scandinavia for a while, and Stalin was fixated on eliminating Trotsky. Saw Trotsky as a rival, wanted to get rid of him, would make life difficult for any country that was trying to host him, at times sent assassins after him, and in the end, actually, Trotsky does die assassinated by Russian Soviet agents, right? So it's a hard life for Trotsky. He's safer outside of Russia than in it, but he's still not safe, right? It goes all the way to Mexico, and Trotsky ends up killed. The assassin comes at him with an ice pick and basically hits him over the top of the head, and Trotsky ends up dying from that. In terms of Stalin's overall outlook, because we need to understand his mindset to understand what happened in Russia and why there was such suffering under his rule. Part of it seems to have been because he came at things from a lower socioeconomic background. He was never secure. He always felt that there was a risk that someone would come and take what he had away. Okay? Let me try and explain it this way. If you have grown up in comfortable and secure circumstances, you tend to worry less that other people around you are going to be a threat because you have grown up comfortable, secure, loved, let's say, by your family. A child who grows up without that kind of background, where everything is always unstable and the threat of violence is always there, tends to almost hit out in advance of having any threat come real in their life, especially if they can hit out. So Stalin ended up being a very defensive kind of guy, someone who was never comfortable or secure feeling. And that meant that in extreme cases, as in his case, it led eventually to paranoia. This fear that everybody was out to get him, and that there were plots, and that he was vulnerable, and that the way to deal with these plots were preemptive strikes. And that's a lot of what he did, especially in the 1930s, and we'll see that in a moment. Alcohol and violence were part of his childhood, and it seems to have continued into his adulthood. Russians are known and were known at the time for heavy drinking, and Stalin was no exception. He was married twice. He had 3 children. He does not seem to have been loving towards his spouses particularly, maybe his first wife, but definitely not his second wife. He had 2 boys and a girl, and seems to have been only really affectionate to his daughter, not to the boys. He basically gave his sons a hard time. They never lived up to his expectations of manliness or character or anything that he wanted them to do. That did not work well at all. It's fair to say that none of his family's lives ended up happy. His one son tried to commit suicide more than once. I mean, it's just really difficult personal situations in the household. His second wife took her own life. It's just one thing after another in a family that was struggling all the way along. He was always, again, convinced that he knew better than the experts. And part of that might have been his desire to show that his background didn't hold him back. He distrusted professionals. He saw himself with pride as a man of the people with common sense. And this is true in all sorts of areas, in art, in military matters, in science and technology. Okay, so, I mean, you could make a case that it's good to have a common sense approach to problems, and that sometimes experts are so fixated on their own subject that they don't think about the wider picture. But what's your sense if someone tells you, well, I don't trust the experts, I'm a man of the people? What's your reaction? What's your response to that? Does it make sense? Do you think, maybe not? Just where, in what context would you not like to hear someone say, I don't trust the experts, I'm a man of the people? Vaccinations, yeah, anything medical. Okay, I would sure not like my doctor to tell me, hey, you know what, forget training, I'm a man of the people. I want you to be expert. I want you to be expert when you're flying a plane. I want you to be expert when you're doing surgery. This seems like it's important, okay? Knowing what you're doing is kind of crucial. And Stalin did not trust experts, and I think because he saw them as threatening, right? They had knowledge he didn't have. So the way around that problem is to say, well, I'm as good as you, my expertise is as good as yours, I can be the one telling you how things are supposed to go. And he may have, had some grounds to be afraid that experts would show him up, because he didn't know as much as he thought he knew. And there's dangers, because what tended to happen was he became very rigid in his thinking. And the mindset of a communist system where there's ideas about what should be happening, coupled with his own sense that he knew better than others, it's a dangerous combination. It's a really dangerous combination, as we will see in a moment. Questions at this point about the young Stalin and his rise to power? Right here in front. Marjo's coming with a mic.
Wasn't his son taken prisoner during World War II?
Yeah,
And a possible swap was arranged, and Stalin says, I won't trade a field marshal for a common soldier.
Yeah, his son, one of his two sons, was captured. So both the sons were sent into the military in different units or different aspects of the military. And the one son was captured by the Germans. And the Germans were willing to consider a trade once they figured out who they had. They have Stalin's son, and they think that's a good bargaining chip. And the problem was Stalin was utterly convinced that only death was the glorious response. If you weren't going to win in battle, you had to die. So if you're captured, it's like you're a traitor. And it was his son that had been captured, his son whom he didn't think much of to start with. So Stalin was not at all interested in the swap for his son, basically hung him out to dry. And the son died in a German prison camp. So it didn't, that was not good for the son's point of view. Obviously, there was nothing there. He was not valued at that point. And you can sort of understand why you wouldn't want to do special favors for the son of the ruler, of the person in charge. But the lack of family feeling of any kind was definitely deeply troubling. Good point. Anything else right now? All right, on we go. So, 1928, Stalin ends the new economic policy. He was never convinced, had never been convinced all the way along that it was really a communist plan. And as far as he was concerned, the new economic policy was way too capitalist. It didn't agree with communism, and he didn't want it. So, the new ideas was to try to get the Russian economy sorted so that it would have measurable improvements. And he did this by creating what were known as the 5-year plans. And you've probably heard this phrase, the Stalin's 5-year plans. Okay. So the idea was, in a sense, it's a form of strategic planning. Okay, raise your hand if you've ever done strategic planning in any kind of group you've been part of. Okay, it's often a lot of meetings. Yeah, and you look at goals and targets and how you're going to get to those goals and targets. Okay. The best strategic plans, and correct me if I'm wrong, are those that are reasonably flexible. In other words, they're not rigidly saying this must happen, because circumstances can change, right? A rigid strategic plan is not actually very strategic, honestly, right? If you're laying out targets and say these must be met and there's no other alternatives, you're actually not that good of a planner. Because that's not how life works. It does not work in rigid number categories, right? You have to adapt, you have to be flexible, you have to give a range, you have to have, targets are good, but to say it must be so is not necessarily a good way to manage. 5-year plans for Stalin were production quota oriented, and it was a numbers game the entire time. You have to reach this number in the production of whatever it is that you do. So it was not tied to anything else. So his statements were simply, by 5 years from now, we will have produced X in whatever the commodity was. It was not tied to demand. It was not tied to markets. It was not even tied to need for the product. It was simply saying, right now we're making this much, and in 5 years we need to make that much. okay, with a higher goal on the 5 year down the road. Does everybody follow how this works? Okay. It is totally, completely mathematical. There's no assessment of the need. There's no evaluation of markets or whether we need this many of whatever it is. Never mind. It's a numbers game. You must reach that target. The end result was forced rapid industrialization, because many of these targets were industrial targets. And Stalin really liked heavy industry, and he liked technology in that sense in his day. And so, well, if they're targets, we'll have to create more factories, we'll have to put all this out and get this going. In many ways, if you've ever studied the history of China, it's very similar to China's Great Leap Forward. Okay, that period in China where they were really trying to move from what had been largely an agricultural world to an industrial world, with all the downsides and really tragedy involved in trying to make that happen really, really fast by government decree. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union was still largely agricultural, right? You remember under the Tsar, it's like 90% of the people live in the countryside. And that was all of 50 years back. So it's not changed drastically by the 1920s. So it's a big, big change. The forced changes had a lot of implications. People were moved off the land into the cities to run the factories. Okay, but then who's going to do the land, right? Who's going to farm the land? That's a problem. There was a decision, okay, the new economic policy, we're done with that, so there's no more private property, no more peasants owning small bits of land, maybe small vegetable gardens, but that's about as far as it goes. And the peasantry were essentially turned against each other. And the group that suffered most were the ones who were considered the wealthiest peasants. They were known as the kulaks. K-U-L-K, make me spell right, K-U-L-H-A-K-S. I think I've got that right. The H might be somewhere else in the word. I'll check it. So the idea is, okay, we're not doing private peasant land ownership. We'll do collective farms instead. Okay. Now, there are models of collective farms that work. I'll grant you that, right? Today, there's some places, even in the US, that do a kind of farming where it's for the community. And you can buy a share in that farm, and you can get your vegetables from that farm, and so on. The other area that's done a lot of collective farming is Israel. Okay, there's a big tradition of collective farming in Israel. But this is forced collective farming, okay? So let's think about this. Talk to me about forced collective farming. What do you think is going to happen if you tell people, okay, no private land ownership, we're going to have collective farms, and that's how we're going to produce our food? Tell me what's going to happen. Say one at a time. Go ahead over here. No motivation. So in general, collective stuff, if it's not something you want yourself, it's hard to feel motivated. That's one problem. What else? Because, okay, if you were someone who had something, now you're unhappy, right? No motivation, resentment. Now, also, again, bear in mind, part of the population has been shifted to the cities, right? So there's fewer people on the land to do the work. There's not necessarily a whole lot of machinery to do things. It's going to be a hard, hard switch. It's not going to go well. Generally speaking, this move to 5-year plans was very detrimental, especially in the rural areas, because those who could not go to the cities were left to farm. Often they were the older people, and so they don't have, the health and the energy to do too much. And then there's no real incentive to do this work because you're not being paid for it. You're part of this system somehow. And you're set quotas, and you have to produce this much, including in grain and farming, whatever you're growing, you have to produce this much in quotas all the time. So the strategies, how to make this happen? Well, this is, again, forcible collective farming. If you didn't like the idea, you didn't want to do it, well, you're going to be sent to labor camps. You're going to be sent away from your family and imprisoned somewhere else. So a number of the kulaks, the ones who were the more wealthy farmers, paid a heavy, heavy price for this. And the resistance to collective farming was very high, especially among peasants who had something, who didn't want to lose it. So rather than be part of this system and lose what little they had, some peasants actually actively destroyed their stuff so that the government could not get it. So they slaughter their cattle in order not to let them be collective. The impact in the 1930s was a drop of 1/2 of the total herd of animals in the Soviet Union. Horses went from 26 million to 15 million in 4 years. Cattle from 67 million to 34 million. So rather than let your stuff be taken by the government, some peasants preferred to slaughter their animals rather than lose them that way to the government. Stalin and his government, meanwhile, pretended that all was well and that the movement to collective farms was voluntary. And there's a lot of propaganda surrounding harvest. Okay, so first of all, how do you figure out how large the harvest is? There's different ways of doing it. You could base yourself on the grain that's growing in the field and extrapolate from that what the harvest is going to be. Any farmers around here? Good plan? Bad plan? If I look at my plants and I say, oh, look, I have these many corn plants. I'm going to get this much corn. Good. Does that work or not, as far as you know? It doesn't work, does it? No, because drought hits or animals or insects or I don't know what. You don't get 100% of yield from the plants you have in the field. You're much better off counting the actual harvest at the end of the day and saying, well, I got this many bushels of whatever, right? But what Stalin and his men did, who were overseeing all this, is they would look at the crops in the field and decide how much that was going to be in terms of harvest, and then require that amount of harvest to be produced. You can't win as a peasant, right? You can tell them, I'm sorry, the insects ate half of it, and they don't care. They said, you had that much grain, we saw it in the fields, produce it. And you can't. You don't have it. They don't care. They want what they said was the number on the piece of paper, and that's what you have to produce. So it ends up being very, very difficult. At times, the harvest estimate was overinflated by 40%, right? So it's nowhere near possible to do that. And all of this had to go to the government, and they're asking for more grain than actually exists. Like, you can't magically produce it. It's not there. And there's nothing you can do. Let's look at the first of the documents, because it shows you a little bit about what that crisis was like. This is from 1932. A letter from Ivan Gusev about farming on the kolkhoz, which is the collective farm in the North Caucasus in 1932. The members of the Budenyi kolkhoz find themselves without grain. The grain we had was taken away by the former Shakhtin district, and the Novosherkaks district says, you gave it to us yourselves, hand over your documents. For food, they say, you'll get no grain, but we'll give you grain for planting. But whatever shall we do without bread? What will we have to eat until the next harvest? He who bolted in time for work in industry did well for himself. He can eat and live and has bread to eat. And the others made a dash for it, but late. Written permissions are now not being given by the Rural Soviet, which says, if you all leave, there'll be no one to do the work. Now we are left naked, barefoot, 200 grams of barley bread a day, and we eat cabbage without butter. It's terrible to see a big, strong man cry. And he cries because they have deceived him with the kolkhoz, because he's left without a farm, without bread, without clothes, and he's lost his freedom. We don't want anything. We'll give up our huts and home country if they'd only give us permission to leave so we could go to industry. What's the point of us kicking the bucket in the kolkhoz from not eating? It's a very honest letter, right? And this is the kind of letter to get you in trouble with the Soviet authorities, by the way. But he's showing the problem of peasants who end up in a situation that's impossible. They can't produce what they're asked to produce, and they have no food to sustain them between one harvest and the next. And they envy those who've gone to work in industry because at least they've got something to live on. Meanwhile, in the kolkhoz, they don't. And the end result in certain areas was very, very bad. In Ukraine in particular, In 1932-33, there's basically total starvation. And part of that was also, so the Ukraine is a very fertile area, right? It's like the best area for growing things in almost all of Russia. Very fertile, known for its potatoes and its grain, and it's a really lush, beautiful area to grow things in. But again, because the Soviets had required so much out of the farming areas, the Ukrainians couldn't produce it, and the Ukrainians had always sort of had a push for independence, and this upset Stalin and caused concern among some of the Soviet leadership, so it's both a political problem and an economic one. And between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians died of famine in 1932 and 33. Because the crop harvest that Stalin had decreed would be produced was larger than what was actually produced. All the food was taken, the peasants had nothing left to eat. The famine was at first denied by the Soviet authorities, and then they later blamed it on the drought. And they said it wasn't, at first, oh no, there's no real famine, and then, well, maybe there was a bit of a famine, but it was because it was dry. Even speaking of the famine in the affected areas could land you in jail, right? It could be a blame. Now, the Ukrainians have remembered this, okay? And they actually give it a proper name. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Holodomor. And I don't know if you can see in the picture, there's people walking by, and then you can see like things by the fence there. Those are people's bodies. They have died of starvation. And Holodomor means essentially death by starvation. And the Ukrainians are very aware of what happened, blame it on Stalin, and essentially say it was deliberate. That it was a deliberate policy of the Russian government to starve out their desire for independence. And there are memorials in all sorts of areas. Canada has a fairly large Ukrainian population. So there's monuments to the Holodomor kind of in various places, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, kind of remembering those who died of this starvation. So a very, very difficult situation for them. Now, Stalin's own view of the 5-year plans was very, very successful, right? These are the propaganda posters you see all the time. So here's a poster. It says, the arithmetic of an industrial financial counterplan. 2 plus 2 plus the enthusiasm of the workers equals 5. Okay? So it's almost as if we can get beyond where we will, what we could be, normally through the normal processes because the workers are enthusiastic standing behind it, and we will reach our targets in the 5-year plans. Even the stamps gave slogans on them. So you post a letter in the Soviet Union at this time, you get a stamp. Here are the slogans on your stamps. So one of them says, this is 1929, for the lower cost of goods sold, for work discipline, for the better quality of a product. Okay, so all this is what we're going to achieve. The second one, let us increase the harvest by 35%. Okay, again, if you're in farming, not normally very realistic. The next one, more metal, more machines. And the fourth one, iron, 8 million tons. Okay, so set a target and try to get it and just kind of push people to get that far along. The results were disastrous in many ways. Okay, these 5-year plans were a real challenge. On the surface, things look good. Okay, there's impressive large-scale projects that are built in this period, like dams and railroads. Between 1929 and 1934, the Soviet Union reported an economic growth rate of about 27%. That's pretty stunning. But underneath, things were not getting done. People were not getting the basics they needed, including food. And the Soviets still lacked much to trade with internationally. They have grain that they export, but they don't have much else. And they sell the grain in order to get hard currency, but they end up selling the grain even at times where there's not enough food at home, right? So it's like a double whammy for the hungry population. It was important to Stalin and his government to show off the success of their plans. So even if it wasn't successful, you weren't going to hear about it. You don't hear anything that says, oh, we kind of missed our target in the 5-year plan. That's not something you hear. Every time it's, oh, success, 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 all the way down the line. And people who were part of this process get a lot of credit and kudos. So here's two of the faces of success under Soviet Russia under Stalin. The one on the left is Alexei Stakhanov. He was a jackhammer operator, and he is famous for producing 14 times more coal than his quota in under 6 hours. 102 tons. Okay, this does not even sound realistic to me. A guy with a jackhammer producing 102 tons of coal. In fact, later on it was said it was very much a team effort. But he had a quota, and he beat it by 14 times, and he becomes like a hero of the 5-year plans and of Stalin at this time. He gets a medal. There's a group called the Stakhanovites, who are all people who try to beat each other in terms of making their quota. And the woman on the other side is a similar kind of thing. She has a reputation. She was one of the first Russian women to operate a tractor. She headed a team of female tractor drivers that exceeded 129% of their quota, presumably in plowing. I couldn't figure out what it was that they did exactly, but let's say it's plowing, in 1933. Okay, and she becomes very famous as well. They all get medals. They're part of a club. They're invited to big party affairs in Russia when they have like big meetings and so on. And they're brought out and kind of paraded around and shown off almost as these extra ardent people that are part of the 5-year plan system. All right, questions at this point? Yes, right here. I'll wait, the microphone's coming.
It's not a question, but an observation.
Yep.
A good example is the making of nails. Mm-hmm. They were required to make, say, 100 tons of nails. Mm-hmm. And they produced big nails, because then you quickly get to 100 tons.
Yes.
But nobody could use the nails.
No.
They were useless.
Exactly. So you hit your target, but whether or not it's needed, whether or not it's a good quality, that's a sort of whole different question.
In 1967, Eugene Lyons, a Marxist Trotskyite, wrote a book, Workers' Paradise Lost. Mm-hmm. And he compared the economic production in 1917 with 1967, which was the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And actually the Soviet Union had not progressed in many fields like agriculture, industry regressed.
It had gone down, exactly. And that's certainly something that people were struggling with, to almost be part of a system where it almost has its own internal logic of greater and greater production, but with no awareness that you actually have to produce something that people want or need. So you hit your target, yay, hooray, but if nobody needs or wants it, or if it's not of good enough quality, well, that's kind of pointless, guys. But that's not part of the thinking, right? It's the target, hit the target, go past the target every time. Yes, right here.
So I'm just curious, how were these individuals selected? Were they like the best of a sorry lot, or were they just picked at random, or?
No. I mean, so it's a very supervised environment. So every factory, every mine, every agricultural collective has essentially government employees present who are watching over everything, supervising everything, and so on. So if you want to break a record or whatever, you do it and you show it off to the government representative who is in your factory or on your field or in your farm. And they then say, well done, wonderful, and I'll send a note to the head office, and then it gets kind of up the line that way. So it's more of a desire to show off for the officials that are always omnipresent. And it has the effect also of making people feel very supervised all the time, right? It's hard to be doing your work just by yourself quietly, because everyone's kind of breathing down your neck talking quotas all the time. So it's not a restful work environment by any way, shape, or form. All good? All right. Let us now look a little bit at the Soviet Union. Okay, so here's the USSR. It became a very large landmass divided into different republics. And in 1922, they're called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They're not autonomous, these republics. They're all controlled from Moscow. So you can see Russia is the big central red one. Then the next three are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Belarus is really hard to see on this map. It's kind of small and in the very western corner. Ukraine is that yellow one, okay? And then you've got Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia are down the bottom by the Black Sea, essentially. And then on the other side, down the middle, you have the major stands, as it were. So you've got Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. But the Soviet Union was all of these together, with Russia providing, obviously, the bulk of the landmass itself. There was worries in Moscow about any kind of independent movement in any of these republics. And if there was any incipient desires for independence, these were quickly crushed. Quick moves against any form of nationalism. The Soviet Union was worried about any divided loyalties. So the southern republics, so the Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so on, a lot of the population there were Muslim. And the Russian leadership, the Soviet leadership in Moscow, was very worried about any incipient Muslim uprisings, so they keep a very tight lid on that. And there's also concern about Jews in the Soviet Union, and that's back to the anti-Semitism that I mentioned earlier, which affected not just individuals, but also whole communities. It's not a good time to be in the Soviet Union as someone who's Jewish. There's a lot of anti-Semitism going around, a fear that the Jews aren't really loyal to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and that they're almost inherently suspicious of someone who's Jewish or Christian, right? I mean, to be a Christian in this period is a very difficult thing, either as a believer or as a priest. It's a very dangerous situation to be in. So there's tensions in terms of the communists worrying about anyone who might have loyalties to anything else, whether another religion, an ethnic group that's their own. That's all causes of concern. The biggest impact, however, of the Stalinist years, apart from, the forced collectivization of the farms and the 5-year plans in the economy, the biggest challenge really was the results of Stalin's growing paranoia. And this resulted in a period known as the Great Purge. And you can tell from the word already it's not going to be good, okay? The Great Purge, which really took its time in the 1936 to 38, but honestly, before and after, it's not a whole lot better. And it demonstrated itself in the following ways. Stalin was worried about plots. And some of the plots he associated with Trotsky. So if you had any kind of tie with Trotsky, near or far, you could be in trouble for that. If you were an original member of the Bolsheviks from way back when, well, Stalin was worried about plots from them as rivals to him, so that could be a problem. If you were an expert in something that Stalin felt that you were trying to essentially take over power in any way, shape, or form, well, you'd be in trouble for that. If you were an artist and you weren't sufficiently into communism or you had a more relaxed lifestyle, well, you could be in trouble for that. I mean, basically it seemed you could be in trouble for anything eventually. And so the purges become a movement where Stalin gives quotas, honestly, to his secret police. You shall arrest this many people and you shall execute this many people, and it happens. And here too, it's like the competition. Can I fill my quota? Can I go past my quota? And that becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy. So you're looking for people who are not sufficiently loyal to the movement. How do they get evidence? They get evidence from people who give names, often under torture, of other people that they know who are not sufficiently loyal. Or perhaps they give names in order to protect themselves. Oh, I'm a good communist, but my neighbor down the road, people are made to testify against each other. Any kind of behavior that might be in any way, shape, or form suspicious. Oh, they got mail from another country. That must be something bad. We have to report them. And reporting them can be a protection for yourself. Report someone else, and that sort of takes the tension off you, at least for a little while. The problem really boiled down to the fact that Stalin believed that people were not loyal enough to him, and if they were not loyal enough to him, in his mind it meant they were not loyal enough to communism. And if they were not loyal to communism, well, that was a threat to the stability of the Soviet Union, so they needed to be dealt with. And he found people in the secret police, in the army, who were willing to do his bidding. And they themselves knew that if they weren't sufficiently enthusiastic in their duties, they themselves could be targeted, right? So it becomes a complete vicious circle where people are trying to outdo each other in terms of denouncing people, dealing with people, liquidating people, and so on and so forth. There are show trials that take place in this period. And in these show trials, the way it works is the people who are put on trial are made to say publicly, oh yes, I have been plotting against the Soviet Union. Oh yes, I've been working with Trotsky. Oh yes, I've been doing whatever it is. And there's clear evidence that they were compelled into giving these. There's one case of a man who came to the show trial who was supposed to be giving evidence to show that he was such a bad person, and he rejected his earlier confession right in the middle of the courtroom. Well, they stopped the trial, took him away. The next day brought him back, and this day he did say his confession, but in the meantime, his shoulder had been dislocated, and probably not by accident, okay? So there's a lot of violence going on, and it's a very, very scary time to be in Russia. So the system works by the leaders being able to count on the fact that people are scared they will be the next victims. So in order not to be the next victims, they'll turn somebody else in to avoid being suspicious themselves. The quotas were such that people get arrested, people get imprisoned, whether or not they're guilty, honestly, of anything, and most of them not at all, right? And sent away to labor camps or taken out to be shot. There was an area near Moscow where they would take people at night and just shoot them, bang, 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 one after the other. And so it becomes a very difficult and dangerous period. Children are encouraged to turn in their parents, which is definitely a new low. Charges could include things like plots to overthrow the state, conniving with Trotsky, or with Western European fascists by the time we get closer to World War II. Trying to restore capitalism, wrecking Soviet industries, being a bourgeois, being the wife of an enemy of the people. You just couldn't win. So in the decades of the 1930s, between 400,000 and 1 million people were killed in Stalin's purges, and between 7 and 10 million were prisoners. And they're prisoners in the Gulag system, and we'll look at that in a minute. Often they're working on very large-scale projects as prison labor. They're underfed, they're lacking medical care and adequate clothes. The Soviet plan, again, was kind of very cold in terms of its way of working. They keyed the food that you got based on the amount of work you did. Okay? Well, that's kind of also not very effective, because if you start getting weak or sick, you get less food because you're not able to produce much, and then you die. But the authorities are not worried about that, because there's got a lot of people coming behind to fill up the prisons again, so it's not really a problem. And then the plots are such that Stalin, before World War II, did a purge of his military, because he was worried they were going to take over. Now, it's 1939, 38, 39. He doesn't know that the war is about to break out, but it almost is, and he does another purge in 1941 because his military is not doing well enough. But again, what you're doing is you're getting rid of the experts, the people who know what they're doing, and that's generally not such a good plan. So I have some pictures from the gulags, and you can't see too much because there's just a lot of pictures there, but it's pretty miserable. For the people who are in the camps and for their families as well. And I'd like us to look at the second document in that light. This is document 2, a letter from Boris Trapezontsev to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. So he's writing to the government, to the heart of the government, December of 1938. I am a pupil in the 7th grade at school number 14 in Leningrad. I request that you consider my petition. On 17 January 1938, my mama, Anna Pavlovna Trapezonteva, was exiled from Leningrad to Lisky in Voronezh Oblast, in the case of my father, Gavril Borisovich Trapezontsev, who was arrested in Leningrad on the 27th of October 1937. And in January 1938, he was exiled to the Far East. My mother's sister, who works at the State Hermitage, became my guardian. I spent last summer with my mother in her place of exile. I found her in very grave condition, destroyed by grief and her separation from me. True, she's now working in her vocation as a teacher in a first-stage school on the Kolkhoz at Piskovo Station, Voronezh Oblast. Mama writes me in her letters that the youngsters have come to love her, and the school administration values her as an experienced educator, yet she has no peace thinking of the school that she was forced to leave in Leningrad. She is suffering a lot. I'm only 14 years old. I lived my whole life with my parents. I don't know what my father was guilty of. No one has given us any answers, even though Mama stubbornly tried to get some. I only know that my Mama is not guilty of anything. I ask you to review the case and return Mama, since it is very painful for me to live and study by myself. Please, I beg you, answer my letter. I can hardly wait. I'm enclosing a character reference from her former job. That's one brave little boy. And he's trying to deal with a situation that is way beyond most of us trying to even conceive what that would be like. The documents collection I had, there was no evidence that his mother had ever returned, not least during this period. So, this tears families apart. It puts people in difficult moral situations. It's traumatic, it's violent, and it's really, really terrible. Any people with questions or things you want to ask about? Yes, go ahead. A question here in the front, Marjo.
I'm just curious, what is an oblast?
It's a district. So it'll be the district that he's living in. So what they did was they divide everything into the different states of the Soviet Union, and then they have administrative districts below that. So they kind of call it, it's the Russian word for that particular jurisdiction. It's a political jurisdiction, basically. Go ahead. There's a question here on the third row. Pass it around.
Were very many of the Christians part of the people that were sent to the Gulag and killed?
Yes, especially Orthodox priests, right? That's a dangerous occupation to be in. I mean, it's hard to say, to make a credible defense that you're not part of some kind of opposition group when you're a priest of a religion that the communists have declared is wrong and the state is atheist, and here you are a priest. So it's a very dangerous time to be a recognizable member of the religious community. So certainly Orthodox priests suffered a great deal. Believers, ordinary believers, I haven't found a lot that says they were targeted specifically for being Christian, but more that there were a whole lot of other things going on that they were maybe doing or not doing that made them targets. In other words, they're not actively sought out as Christians, but the fact that they are Christians might lead them to behave differently than others, and therefore they're also targeted. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yuko?
In thinking about Stalin, was he actually driven by a real principled ideology or by simply desire for power?
Was Stalin driven by ideology or by a thirst for power? That's a hard question to answer. He cloaked his rules and his powers and his understanding of who was right and who was wrong in ideology, right? And said, it's for the good of the state and for the good of communism and so on. I don't think he was a very deep thinker, right? So is it power? Is it ideology? It might have been the ideology that he understood insofar as he understood it. But behind it was clearly his desire to stay put and to be in power. If the ideology was the thing, then in some ways, unless he feels he's vital to the ideology, stepping down and letting someone else have a turn would be a very normal way to look at things. There's nothing in communism that says you have to have one man rule, right? And if it does, it doesn't say anywhere it must be Stalin. The fact that he could not trust anyone around him and was desperate to hang on to power the whole time suggests it's more the power, even though he cloaks it in ideology, it's more the power that's at the foundation of all of these problems. Other questions or comments? I did have a video, but we're running out of time, so I think what I'll do is I'll save it for next time. We'll do a question here in the front. And we'll probably make this our last question.
Were there any attempts to overthrow him, like by his inner circle or anything like that?
There were certainly some assassination attempts, but nothing obviously that worked. And the dangers of planning something like that were very, very high, because he's already worried about non-existent plots. Can you imagine what he would do if there was a real plot? So in this period, in the 1930s, I don't think there was any, I'd have to look and make sure to see if there was any actual assassination attempts during this period. And then the thing is, World War II happens, and he becomes, certainly in legend, if not in fact, the savior of Russia, the savior of the Soviet Union, both in the Soviet Union and actually worldwide, Uncle Joe Stalin, and we'll talk about this next time, a rather positive image. So after that, planning an uprising is harder, right, because he's gained in popularity. And the propaganda was really strong, right, to make him like the beloved father figure. You have all these pictures of him with his arms around little kids, and they're giving him flowers, and they're all cheering him, and so on. So it's an uphill struggle to try and overthrow him, I think. Philip, did you have something you want, just one last one? Okay, one last quick one. Oh, on count line first? Okay.
How did the name Stalin get derived from his actual given name?
So every Russian leader of this time picks their own little pseudonym, and his Stalin thing is essentially man of steel, right? It's not anything to do with his name. So he picked that, and he picked it as what he wanted to call himself.
And how would you compare Stalin's psychological profile with other authoritarian leaders like Hitler and Idi Amin?
Well, that's a good question. I'm doing at the same time as I'm doing this class, I'm doing a class for Aquinas, for their program, and I'm doing it on Germany between the wars. So I'm not having a very happy time over these weeks, I have to tell you. It's one horror after another. What's interesting, and some of the books I was looking at suggested that Stalin really, again, cloaked everything within the logic of the ideology of communism. And therefore, when someone was arrested or executed and put on trial, it had to be because they were against communism, right? There was an ideological reason why they were being punished. Hitler organized things such that you could be part of a group. You didn't have to have done anything, right? You're Jewish, apparently, and hey, presto, you're out. So it was more of an ideology for Hitler where his view of this sort of master race idea was his dominant thing, and it was less tied to a particular system of government with a logic of how the economy should work and so on and so forth. So but in terms of the effects, there's not much different. I'm sorry. Every tyrant, no matter what tyrant they are kind of similar in their effects. Fear, violence is the tools of their trade. Absolutely. All right. I think we've got to stop because we're almost past our time. Thank you all very much, and we'll carry on next week for our last session.